Welcome everyone, and it is a real pleasure to be with you all today for this session, one of our final sessions that we've titled Caring Work, Economics as if People and the Planet Matter. Dedicating this class to Andaye, social justice warrior, Red Thread co-founder. That's her image there. She was my older daughter's godmother, and that's actually a picture of my daughter on her first visit to Guyana when she was 6 months old 20 years ago. Andaye's book, The Point is to Change the World, has actually just come out. The shipment is on its way here to Toronto. And so it's in this April month that it seems somewhat fitting to dedicate today's class to her memory and to think about the kinds of things we're thinking about today that are really things that defined her life's work. So the outline for today is what I wanted to do is to spend, I've asked for 2 hours, and in the first hour, I guess, or less, we'll see how it goes. I wanted to sort of just go over some terms as we're coming to the end of this course on feminist political economy, which is thinking about questions of power, questions of inequalities along lines of gender, age, race, sexuality, gender, generation, to think about. So I wanted to spend the first part of today's class just returning to some concepts, defining them, setting up a kind of framework in the first hour or the first part of today's class, and then using that kind of conceptual framework to walk through some lessons from the Guyana floods of 2005, and in particular, the inspiring response of the Red Thread women, some of whom are on the line. Depending on how timing goes, I may ask them to hold until we get to the breakout groups, because I have a specific question for the Red Thread women. So what we might do is, if there's more than one Red Thread women, Roberta, we can figure out how we do that when we get to the breakout groups. And then we'll sort of come back and have a quick conversation and then share the rest of the material next week with Peggy, and as we begin to wrap this work up. So we're going to be talking about the sexual division of labor, social reproduction, what it means to think about reframing value, and how that can lead into an activist campaign in general. And then we're going to look at how that got taken up as an activist campaign in the response to the floods that took place in Guyana in 2005. We're going to wrap that session by thinking with an amazing transgendered activist from the United States called Dean Spade, who has done some wonderful and beautiful, very accessible work. You don't need to have a set of letters behind your name to understand Dean Spade's work on mutual aid. So just reflecting with that and thinking about, okay, what might be some of the ways we can draw on this material to inspire how we might respond to the current pandemic. It's not letting me, why is it not letting me? Oh, okay. I wanted to begin with this poem from Jamaican poet Lorna Goodison, Controlling the Silver. It's a fantastic poem that pays tribute to Caribbean women and the work that they do, that is the foundation of our region as we know it. Let us praise now market women, higglers who maintain our solid hidden economy in soft money banks between full breasts, gold next. Now these women control silver. I'll just interject to say at one point during slavery, higglers and the informal economy in Jamaica had more silver in their control than actual plantation society. Let us praise now artisans and craft workers, builders of empire. Hail, O basket weavers, potters, calabash carvers, seamstresses of garments stitched from ripped-off ends of regulation Osnaburg, skilled recyclers of Mrs.'s old clothes. So I wanted to open by thinking about something that we have talked about a lot this term. I'm speaking to you as if it's a class in this course, a formal university class, and that is the gender sexual division of labor. And just to reprise at a very sort of basic level, it refers to who does what. We tend to think of it along the lines of gender, usually in a binary system, women, men, but remember we're in the contemporary moment, we could be thinking about women, men, gender non-conforming persons, gender queer persons, but who does what? And it tends to refer to the allocation of jobs and responsibilities that fall not just according to gender, but according to generation, right? So that there might be certain kinds of work that is allotted to children in a household, or certain kinds of things that young girls do as opposed to young boys. So we can think about it as well in relation to position, so that in a Indo-Caribbean joint or extended family household, for instance, the young wife who arrives in her mother-in-law's household before she has a child will end up doing most of the domestic work relative to the elder woman. And that's not just a generational thing. That has to do with one's position in an extended kind of family structure. So we can think about a gender and sexual division of labor as basically telling us who does what. The next slide, I wonder if someone could unmute and read this first page. This was from a study done by the International Labour Organization in 1977 that sort of maps what a sexual division of labor not only looks like, but begins to open up questions of feminist political economy, which is not just who does what, but how do we think about who does what, and why are certain things seen to be natural or ahistorical, that is the way they always were, or functional, that is to say that people who do those jobs are somehow naturally suited to do those jobs. So I have two slides. I'm going to ask someone to come off mute and read the first slide, and then I'm going to ask someone to come off mute and read the second slide. So here's the first one.
Well, let me volunteer then.
Thank you.
Have you many children? The doctor asked. God has not been good to me. Of 15 born, only 9 live, he answered. Does your wife work? No, she stays home. I see. How does she spend her day? Well, she gets up at 4 in the morning, fetches water and wood, makes the fire and cooks breakfast. Then she goes to the river and washes clothes. After that, she goes to town to get corn ground and buys what we need in the market. Then she cooks the midday meal. You come home at midday?
Thank you. Whose voice was that?
That was Maggie.
Thank you, Maggie. Okay, if I can get a second volunteer to read the next slide.
I can go. No. She brings the meal to me in the fields about 3 kilometers from home. And after that, well, she takes care of the hens and pigs. And of course, she looks after the children all day. Then she prepares the supper so it is ready when I come home. Does she go to bed after supper? No, I do. She has things to do around the house until about 9 o'clock. But of course, your wife doesn't work. Of course, she doesn't work. I told you she stays at home.
Okay, who is that?
Vanella.
Vanella. Oh, thanks, Vanella. I'm just going to ask Roberta and Maya as well. If people have a burning question and they want to chat, like if I can't see the chat screen, so you can interrupt and maybe ask me. I wondered if any folks had any comments on what this slide tells us. Any thoughts on what this slide tells us?
Hi, this is Maria. I think it's obviously the idea that the reproductive work is not work, that I think it has changed some since 1977, but still very ingrained in many people's mind that what women do inside the house, it's not work.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Maria. And thank you also for that example. If folks are volunteering and answer or commenting, if you can just preface by saying who is speaking. So I think that's really important. And in fact, what we see from this slide is that these two slides, this woman does 11 things in a single day, just from what her husband says. It doesn't necessarily mean that's all she does, but 11 things in a single day. According to this description, she actually walks, when you count it up, she walks more than 6 kilometers. And I say more than 6 kilometers because the husband doesn't tell us how far she walks to fetch water and how far she walks to go to the market. We know that she goes to the field to bring her husband food and back home. So that alone is 6 kilometers, but she does more than that. And so what we see is that both in terms of time and in terms of space, her day is completely filled, but there is this sense that she doesn't work, right? That her role is as the housewife The husband's role is as the breadwinner. And in that sense, you know, one of the things that is an interesting sort of fact is that the word housework itself wasn't actually introduced into the English vocabulary until the mid-19th century. The word housework was not introduced into the English vocabulary until around the mid-19th century. We don't have time to get into that. If we have time at the end and you want me to explain that, we can talk about industrialization, the emergence of capitalism, the division of into the public and private sphere, the move out of the home and into the factory, the emergence of the household, therefore, as a domestic kind of space governed by the family and by relations of love. That's where I guess I've sort of answered what I was saying we could postpone to the end of the discussion. But it is in that sort of context that this word housework becomes introduced into the English vocabulary. So this term housewife, what does this term suggest to you? When you see this word, what does it actually suggest? Anyone? I know they got plenty talkative Caribbean women on here, so I ain't taking silence for an answer. I'm gonna start calling out people's names.
Nicole.
So thank you, Nicole.
Right, from my perspective, my mother was a housewife, so I always think homemaker.
Excellent.
This is Joy here. The one who takes charge of the home and see that everything is in order.
What else does it suggest to people?
Maggie here. The housewife suggests that there's a husband as well who's outside doing important things.
Excellent. So Maggie's sort of suggesting that this term infers a kind of a heteropatriarchal relationship, that it's not just gendered, but it's gendered in relation to a man in the context of a heterosexual relationship structured through, I guess, marriage, or in the context of the Caribbean, common law. Could be visiting as well, if you're home and the visiting partner is the one who's visiting and working. Yeah. Anyone else?
Hi, this is Audrey. Good morning,
Hi, Audrey.
everybody.
Hi, Audrey.
How are you doing? Good.
Good.
It suggests that she belongs in a confined space in the house. That's where she is to be.
Fantastic.
And it also suggests that she belongs to someone in that house, you know. So it's the property factor is very clear as to where her space is. A woman in Belize said it this way many years ago: "Him just want me hang up in the house like curtain."
Except you would be doing far more work than the curtain.
Right, but in her context, just talking about no movement, can't get out. This is where she's to stay.
Excellent. That's an excellent point of departure that Audrey raises there. Two things, which is about the fixing in space or the restriction spatially, and the other is around a property relationship. And it's not surprising that Audrey would raise that, because the sisters in the Bahamas and Trinidad were some of the most vocal in the feminist movement in the 80s around questions of domestic violence and trying to figure out what happens to a woman in relation to property if she is a survivor of domestic violence, right? So this idea that you're not just confined to the household, but that you belong to the man is really sort of crucial. So that's really excellent. And here are some others here that I want to suggest that the term sort of fixes in our imagination and our way of understanding this world that we live in. So as Audrey sort of pointed out, it sort of makes the private domestic sphere to be woman's place. That somehow becomes naturalized, which means we don't question it. We just assume the woman belongs in the house. That's she domain. The woman is, you know, in the house, and that's where she's supposed to be. The second is that the housewife always sort of exists in relation to the idea of the breadwinner. So if she's the housewife, she can't be a breadwinner, even though we know that over 50% of households in the Caribbean are headed by single parents who are women, which means that they must have a relationship to the labor market. And even women who live with others work, because women, all women in the post-Columbus context, indentured and enslaved women came to the Caribbean to work. They did not come as housewives. So we have to ask ourselves historically then, when does this actually happen, right? So the second thing is that this term suggests that you have you have no relation to the labor market, or if you do have a relationship to the labor market, it is secondary to your primary duty, which is that you're supposed to be a housewife. So it's not as important as your home job. And in fact, research has shown, especially in the context of Latin America and the Caribbean, when it came to export factories, that was these assembly line factories that would produce the kinds of clothes that would then be exported to North America and Europe to be sold, that many of the employers justified paying women less because they said they don't really need it. It's pin money. They're housewives. So this is not really breadwinner money that they need to earn. And there's also this assumption that if you're a housewife, you're also automatically a mother. So you can't really have a real relationship to the labor market because you'll get pregnant and your primary responsibility is or should be caring for children. So it's important to sort of think about these terms and what this language does to us, right? How this language helps to shape the way in which we think, helps to shape our practices, and why in the struggle to change things, the struggle over language, the struggle over how we story our lives is also a terrain of battle in a sense. Let me ask, I'm going to start lecturing shortly, but I just wanted to sort of do this to break the ice and to get people thinking with me as well, because you guys have been following this course for the last 8 or 9 weeks. These are some common sense understandings of housework. Imagine you on the street, in the market, in the grocery store, in a school, and somebody tell you, here now, the thing is natural. The thing is women meant for do that. You see women body, that's a biological thing. Or somebody says to you, housework is a private matter. Or someone says, how could it be work? No one pays you for it, so it's not work. How would you actually respond to those understandings? And I wondered if when folks volunteer, just choose one. So imagine you actually have to convince the person who's saying this to you that that's not correct. How would you refute these very common sense understandings of housework? And I wondered if when people volunteer, just take one of them.
Nicole, I want to take the last one.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have a very actual relationship with it. So in terms of the last piece where it bears no relation to the economy, my mother was a housewife, as I said, and I understood it that her decision to stay home allowed me to everything I needed to ensure that I ended up in the workforce. So even though, yes, it's not paid initially, and it's not work, there's a lot of things that go into a lot of the things. And even though housework, I would tie it into child rearing, it's work. It's a lot of work. I mean, a lot of people are now saying online that, they don't understand how stay-at-home moms do it because now they can't actually function now with children at home. So, and the fact that it doesn't bear any relation to the economy is not true, because the work that they put in allows the breadwinner, if you want to use the story that we used before, to do the stuff outside. So he gets his clothes washed, his iron, food cooked, to then go out. So there is a contributing factor. I know there's a terminology for it, which I can't remember right now.
No, yeah, this is perfect. I mean, he gets into little sex so he could go and be happy the next morning. No, absolutely.
Right, exactly. All that is ensuring that the economy works the way we want to, because if he's a good worker, it means that, yes, she's contributing to the economy.
Thank you. You actually just helped to define social reproduction. That's the term that you're actually looking for. And we'll get to that in the next slide. So that's brilliant. Anyone want to tackle the first or second one?
I wanted to go to the Joy here. I wanted to add to, sorry, I don't remember her name.
Nicole.
Nicole on the third one. I don't know if I should go now or wait.
You can speak briefly to Nicole's own, and then we're going to ask, in the interest of time, everyone to just choose one of the other two. But let me hear what you have to say there, Joy.
All right. So in terms of this housework is not paid and so on, the way I respond to people if they say things like this is, one, that if you go to do this in somebody else's home, you're being paid for it. So if it's not paid work, why are you paying me in somebody else's home? It's the same housework that I'm doing home for no money. I'm going there. And it's because you don't value what I do at home. That is why you're paying me little money to do it in your home. But also, if I don't do it in your home, you can't go out to earn either. Because you would, if I don't come to babysit your child and do your work, then you can't go to your big paying job. So that's to show how important it is and how valuable it is, and should be counted. Also, housework, rearing and bearing children is part of housework. And if all of us decided we were going to stop doing that, we just think about the economy and what will happen to it, because bearing and rearing children is producing for the labor force that holds up the economy.
Thank you. Perfect. Oh my God, the two of y'all sound like perfect Marxists. And a joy cheating because she comes out of years of organizing with Red Thread. So she got this, you know, she has this down, not from reading, but from actually doing this work. But that's actually brilliant. And Joy, what Joy has also put her finger on with the example of paid domestic work is the class difference among ourselves as women. Because actually, many women who go into the workforce because there's a woman in the household doing the paid domestic work that allows them to go look for a job, right?
I just want to add, Alissa, that yeah. I was a domestic worker from a child. My mother was a domestic worker, and I had to go and help her many times and not go to school so that she can finish one to go to the other. And so it starts from there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joy. Anyone want to tackle the other two? I mean, the second one is sort of answered, and we've started to answer it, but anyone wanted to tackle the other two?
Can I share?
Yes, Vanessa from Red.
Hello, Vanessa.
Alissa.
Hi. Go on, Berta.
Yes. Yeah. Housework is not paid. We're not saying that we are paid in the home, but when we go out, we are being paid. And the other thing is that others don't recognize housework as work. Okay, but if, as adding to what Joy said, when you go out to someone's home, you got paid for it and you got little and nothing for that job. Also, you're being pressured because you have to do your work and then go to this job, which you get a little next to nothing for that job that you go in to do in somebody's house. And it's also added to the economy, because though you have to go and do this work, if you earn that, and as well as in your, before you go out to that work, where you have to cook, you have to clean, you have to take care of the children, get them off to school, get your spouse off to work, and things like that. So housework is very, very important.
Excellent. Excellent. And I mean, you know, in the 1980s, there was, we're going to run out of time because I'm up on page 3 and I got 15 pages of slides. So this is fantastic. But somebody was going to speak at the same time as Vanessa. And I'm just going to ask if that one other person could offer their thoughts before I pick back up.
I think it was Vanya.
It was also, Tina had an intervention about number 1.
Okay, so let's take 2 more and then I have to go on. So Vanya and then Tina.
Okay, if I should share, even sometime on Friday past, I had to laugh because there was a lady coming from the market because of the curfew on time and trying to get home. There were some guys on the road and I think something went wrong and she made a comment. The guy said, lady, go at your home and do your work. The other one said, but the lady was in her house already doing her work. How you mean? But that is where she belonged. You know, she needs to go and find work at her home to do instead of being on the road making those kind of comments. And I am saying she's just coming from the market, walking home with whatever load that she had in the bag. But as far as he's concerned, the only work that she has to do is to get back home and to do what is in the house to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed that everything she has to do is only in the house. Vanya, if I'm not mistaken, you're from Dominica, right?
Yes, yes.
And a farmer. So You would know here too that when we talking about the housework, that slide from the ILO that talk about the woman in relation to all the stuff she was doing on the land is something that you would identify with quite deeply.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Excellent. Tina?
Hi, I just wanted to refute the first one around the idea of housework being natural or a biological function.
Thank you.
You know, there is no predisposition to cooking, cleaning, or taking care of children. And often the division of labor in the household is, you know, based on what people are stereotyping as woman's work or a man's work, which is not the case, you know.
Excellent. Excellent. So thank you, all of you. These were fantastic and allows me to sort of lead into the social reproduction slide, but very swiftly, yes, indeed. As Tina pointed out, there's no predisposition. And furthermore, if you were to define it on the basis of certain kinds of characteristics, like being a woman, having a vagina, having breasts, how does that predispose you to clean a toilet? How does that predispose you to sweep a floor, right? I mean, so there's a way in which this idea of the female body then becomes associated with all kinds of things that don't actually make biological sense. Importantly as well, not all women can have children. Not all women ever will have children. Not all women want children. We could start with that slide of my daughter's godmother. She loved to parent and godparent, and one of her youngest children was a little boy called Kevin up to last year when she died. And I was very clear, she didn't want no children. She didn't ever want children. So this assumption that women are all mothers ignores the fact that a huge number of women in our societies are actually not mothers. The idea that housework is a private matter, you've all responded to it beautifully. The only other thing I would add is when the price of food or the price of anything goes up in the world outside of the household, it fundamentally affects what takes place in the household. So this notion that you shut your door and somehow you're insulated from everything that goes on outside also does not stand up to the actual reality of our everyday lives. And then the final one, I think you all answered it so wonderfully, is this notion. There was an anthropologist called Rainer Rapp who said, this idea that housework is not work because you don't pay it is this assumption that women get paid in a coin called love. Women get paid in a coin called love. And interestingly, in 1985, when the Women in the Caribbean Project did this survey with thousands of women, it was somewhat limited because it was almost large numbers of Afro-Caribbean women, so somewhat limited when it came to countries like Guyana and Trinidad. But one of the things they found when they asked women what was work, women didn't just define work by money. They talked about the kinds of things that Tina and Vanessa and Joy and Maggie just talked about. They said work had to do with energy. Work had how much energy was spent. Work had to do with how much time you spent doing something. Work had to do with something that was necessary, that you had to do it. So they didn't define it just in relation to money. And so what we need to ask ourselves is, the fact that it is not seen as work because it is not paid doesn't necessarily mean it isn't work. What it means is we need to ask we need to ask ourselves questions about who determines what gets paid and what doesn't get paid in our society, right? So we have to start challenging this dominant idea that work refers to something that has a price attached to your labor. And that price that is attached to your labor is usually called a wage or a salary. And this idea that it is the wage or the salary that becomes the defining characteristic of work needs to both be refuted as well as to ask ourselves, well, who determines what price is attached to what job we should do? And who then determines what price the stockbroker should make as opposed to the garbage collector? In the context of COVID-19, who is actually the more important worker, the stockbroker or the garbage collector? And yet their salaries are completely at different ends of the scale. There's nothing natural about that. That's a political question, by which I mean that's a question about power, right? So this point that came up, the last one that you answered first so beautifully we call that social reproduction, right? This idea that the work that Nicole beautifully described her mother doing, and that Joy wonderfully described herself and Cora, her mother, doing, is that it is a life-nourishing activity that helps to produce future workers for the workforce. So the sort of language I have here is the physical, mental, and emotional, right? That comforting labor that is involved in the everyday and intergenerational meaning the work I do or the work Nicole's mother did to make sure Nicole could stand on her own 2 feet, and then Nicole's children and, you know, indigenous folks say the next 7 generations, the intergenerational maintenance of life itself. And I think it was Nicole who talked about the work that was done for her mother's partner as well. That's also important, because the idea that the breadwinner is somehow in economics, in mainstream economics and sociological theory, the male breadwinner is usually seen as someone who's independent, autonomous, they stand on their own. But what you all have just described to us is that autonomous person is actually not autonomous at all. They depend on a set of relationships. They depend on a set of caring practices that are buried deep in the household and made invisible. But in fact, without those caring practices, that man could never stand up as a breadwinner in the first place, right? So this is where we see that the household and the economy are actually very closely tied together. Okay, I'm going to try to go a little swifter now. So one of the things, I want to move from those general sort of conceptual observations about the sexual division of labor, what it means to ask what it is, to not take it for granted, what it means to think about social reproduction, is that this kind of understanding can then become the basis of feminist activist campaigns. And one of the really important activist campaigns that feminists sort of began doing, especially in the 1970s and 1980s increasingly, is something that was called a time use survey. In other words, how do we begin to challenge this idea that unpaid work is unimportant? How do we begin to challenge the idea that so much of the work that women are doing in their households is invisible? How do we begin to challenge the idea that this work is seen as not having any value? Well, the first thing we need to do is to actually make this work visibly. If we're going to collectively organize, we have to organize on the basis of knowledge, right? So let us begin by saying, how can we make this work visible? How can we actually count what is being done? And the best way that feminists came up with was something called a time use survey, which is an instrument that allows us to capture how much time each day is spent on, sorry for the grammatical thing there, on unwaged household work and who does it. So one of the things that you can do, so in my class here at the university, for example, I give the students a log and I tell them they're going home for the holidays, whether it's Kwanzaa or Hanukkah or Christmas, and take a log of the one big meal that the family spends together and come back and tell me who did what, from preparing to shopping to cleaning to getting the Christmas cards or the Hanukkah cards to doing all of that. And see if you can figure out how many hours was spent on each person doing what. Red Thread did an amazing survey where the women themselves went into households, grassroots women went into grassroots women's households and worked with women in various ways, either by giving them diaries or sitting there and jotting the notes down themselves. So you could take your entire day from the time, and if we had more time in this class, I would have asked you all to have done this last week, but take one day from the time you got up, make a note of everything you did, with whom, for whom, how much time it took. And the fact is that once they put those diaries together, or once you did that time use survey, it allows us to see how much of this unpaid work is actually done. It allows us to make it visible. And that's establishing the scope, how much. And it also allows us to see who does what, right? Who is doing what. So the Red Thread survey, for example, only worked predominantly with other grassroots women. A comprehensive survey that would allow us to think about gendered disparities would have also been counting what the men did. So going back to that ILO survey, we would have had a time use survey of the man as well. That would show us, well, who is doing most of what in the household? And worldwide, there's not a single study that has come back worldwide that has shown anything different, which is that the bulk of this unpaid work is done by women. So once you have this information, once you have this knowledge, that then becomes what you can use to sort of guide your plans for action. And this is a wonderful slide I like, because it shows you not just how much time is spent doing things, but I'm sure all of the persons on this call can identify with the fact that at any one time you're doing several things. So even a time use survey, which measures you sequentially means one thing after the other, doesn't capture the fact that you're also doing several things simultaneously at any one point in time. You're stirring the pot and looking after the child and answering the phone, right? So at any one time, you're actually doing several things. So your day is not just longer, but spatially, it really doesn't make sense to even just count it in relation to a day. So the time use survey allows us to map these differences and allows us to begin thinking about all kinds of questions of power and inequality. For example, how is this invisible work? What is the effect of this invisible work on the length of a woman's day, right? That woman, that sister that we saw has a 16-hour day. What does it mean that you have a 16 or 18 or 20-hour day in terms of her own health, right? What does it mean that that even when she goes out to find a paid job, when she comes home, that work is still waiting for her at home? And that's what there's an American sociologist who came up with a term, Arlie Hochschild, called a second shift, which is, in other words, or the double day. So you work outside the house and then you come home and you work again, right? And how, for example, in Vanessa's example in the slides a few minutes ago, how is the invisibility of this work linked to the low wages and respect that is given to work that women do outside of the household, or work that looks like the work that is done outside of the household, but that is paid a wage or a salary? So the example that was given of when you do paid domestic work, it's I-pass, because that work is seen as menial work, unskilled work. It's work that's largely invisible and unvalued in the household. So when it becomes transferred into the marketplace, it also takes up secondary importance. And then finally, how does this invisible work make it more difficult for women to enter the marketplace, to get skills, to get education, to be on an equal footing with men, to have the same career trajectory, when if they have a child, it's far more onerous for the woman. It's more of what we call a reproductive tax. She ends up bearing the consequences to her career of having children, whereas for men, it doesn't really work in the same way. So these are all the ways in which this little thing, this little matter of housework, has these much larger ramifications. Okay, so I just wanted to, at this point, give you one or two examples. And this one is from a campaign that the Marxist feminist Selma James was involved in. She was one of the early feminists. There were several. Selma James is well known in the context of thinking of the Caribbean and the United States. The Trinidadian communist Claudia Jones wrote a really incredible essay. I think it was in the mid-1940s, as early as the mid-1940s. So even before Selma and these other sisters were writing, where she talked about the neglect of the problem of the Negro woman. And a lot of what Claudia was talking about was in the context of the United States, and talking about the sort of exploitation, or this, what she called the super exploitation of Black women in the United States. And much of it was also tied to this idea of domesticity and domestic work. But Wages for Housework was one really important sort of transnational campaign that emerges in the 1970s and was part of a much larger plan of action that involved women from around the world, including, and really, I want to say most importantly, I could say it on this call, most importantly, women from the Caribbean, some of whom, like Roberta and Peggy, were part of that. So when we come to the end, I'm going to try to make sure we have enough discussion time so that we can hear from some of our elders on this call. This was a transnational campaign where one of the strategies was to take this campaign directly to the United Nations, which is the institution through which the sovereignty of nation states is recognized, right? If you're not recognized at the United Nations, you're not a nation, right? This is the problem that the Kurds face and the Palestinians face. So feminists decided to go to the United Nations to get this campaign to recognize unpaid work, to get unpaid work recognized by governments. And in 1985, so there are several United Nations decades for women that were, again, also the result of feminist activism and campaigning. The first was, I believe, in Mexico. The second was in Copenhagen. And in Nairobi, which was the third UN decade for women, in 1985, women attended that, and some of them began working on a text, and that text was called The Global Kitchen. And it was a beautiful text that helped to make one of the many cases that would be made for unwaged work to be measured in national statistics. Women continued to campaign and to organize. And in 1995, women went to Beijing. These campaigns were supported by over 1,200 NGOs. So this was the one of the strategies of the 1985 United Nations Decade for Women Conference in Nairobi. But in Beijing, they really sort of amped it up. And the Caribbean was pretty special. And at the end, again, I'll ask Peggy, when we come back from the breakout rooms, maybe to share some of your reflections. But the Caribbean response was pretty special because the Caribbean women organized not just as NGOs in, outside of the official conference, but Caribbean women were also part and parcel of preparing Caribbean government's position on Beijing. So both inside and outside, the feminist strategy was to take place both within the state and outside of it as well, which I think was really quite remarkable. So at the Beijing conference, the campaign managed to secure government agreement for to measure unpaid work in national statistics, to get governments to agree to count unpaid work and to begin putting a value on it. For all of the sisters on this call, way more experienced than me in working on domestic violence or the Convention for Decent Work for Domestic Workers, we know that getting an agreement and getting that agreement ratified and then having that agreement observed and having it enforced is a different thing. So we can have another class on where this does or does not happen. Canada is one of the few countries where in the census, they actually measure and value the unpaid work, but very few countries actually put that into practice. I believe Venezuela, possibly one constitutional provision in the Irish Constitution, but these would be the only two constitutions where it is actually not just, it is recognized as a constitutional right. And this was the result of grassroots women in Venezuela. Red Thread from Guyana actually participated in a transnational solidarity campaign, and several of the grassroots women from Red Thread in Guyana actually traveled to Venezuela to be part of this campaign. But it's the only country, as far as I'm aware, where housework and your entitlement to Social Security as a result of this unpaid housework is enshrined as a constitutional right. So the Wages for Housework campaign would go on to establish the global strike, which since 2000, and this comes back to a really beautiful point that Tina made, since 2000, they called for this annual action that takes place every March 8th for International Women's Day. And it is the principle that, as you all were saying earlier, okay, you say the work we do is invisible, it's not important, it ain't got no value, it ain't got no money attached to it, it's not important, fine. On March 8th, we putting down everything. We ain't sexing the men, we ain't cooking no food, we ain't doing no laundry, we're not doing a single thing. Let us see what would happen. And the point they're trying to make by that is that kind of like with COVID where everything locks down and the economy tanks, they're making an analogous point. If all people who did unwaged work stopped, what do we actually think would happen? Who would clothe and house those employees? Who would look after the children? Who would cook the food? Who would do it? It is the best way of demonstrating, as Salma says here, that unwaged housework is the heart of every economic sector. In other words, the productive economy fundamentally relies on, it's sort of like a parasite, it's parasitic upon this unwaged, unvalued work that is done by women and done predominantly by poor women the world over. Okay, so So, you know, earlier on, I pointed out that this language is such an important part of our struggle, that thinking really carefully about what we call ourselves, those of you who are involved in various organizations, thinking about the language that we use to story our struggle is really an important way of harnessing our imaginations and also ensuring that our practices follow a certain set of consistent principles. And here are two sets of terms that the global strike has sort of introduced as a way of getting us to think more carefully and critically about things that we took for granted. So in the place of housewives, they say unwaged producers, and instead of household, they say social factory. I wondered if folks wanted to reflect here on what do you think is the significance of this shift in language? Any takers? Either of the two. What does social factory tell us that household can't tell us? Or what does unwaged producer tell us that housewife doesn't? Yeah?
Yeah, I think that I wanted to refer to the unwaged producers and not housewife, because I think that the whole term of social reproduction and care work should not apply, and even in our feminist analysis should not apply only to women. So unwaged producers seems as a term that would apply to anyone with any gender and to all of the reproductive work that they do inside and outside the house. Because also when we were discussing the intergenerationality of the reproductive work, it goes both ways to bringing up of the children, but also when people get older, the care work that children that are not young anymore do to their elders. Right. And I think that the COVID crisis has shown to the importance of this other side of the care work and the reproductive work. So I haven't heard these terms before, that social factory instead of household, or unwaged producers. I think that these terms to be used in our analysis might have other, there might be other aspects to consider, especially I'm thinking of the translation of them to Spanish as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the whole point here was, this is who I'm speaking to?
Maria Graciela.
Maria.
Yes.
Thank you, Maria. And so the whole point here is not necessarily that you would have to take those terms on, but is that in your own work that you would be doing in your kind of local context or organizing, what does it mean to actually take up the language that is seen as natural, open it up for critical scrutiny, and then can we put that word back together again? Or do you have to find a different kind of word or phrase in Spanish, right? Or in Creole, or in French, or in, you know, any of the other patois across the Caribbean? Would you, what word would actually allow you to reach people, right? So this is just one example of showing.
Yeah, no, and it's good. And in that sense, I just to conclude, the important part is for me that using anything but housewife shows other dimensions that we really want to show in terms of reproductive work.
Absolutely. Let me just go back. Let me see if I can go back one slide though. I just want to point, Alexandra, I'll come to you in, Alexandrina, I'll come to you in 1 second. I just want to go back to this constitution because Maria raises a really important point. And certainly social reproduction takes place inside and outside of the household. It's that intergenerational caring work. It can be paid or unpaid. It can be done by anyone, right? The point is that what we've seen is that the vast majority of that caring labor tends to be done by women. This constitutional provision at the bottom, there were some people who were asking about, you know, well, this word in the constitution, housewives, which goes to Maria's kind of criticism and really important point, does that not in the constitution tie this to women? And I only draw that to your attention because this was part of a political struggle. And in my conversations with Selma James and the Global Strike, one of the things that they said was the housewife, there was a huge discussion in Venezuela about that term at the time. And Nora Castaneda, who was one of the authors of a little book on creating a caring economy, and others pointed out, it was actually grassroots women of color in Venezuela who wanted this word in there, not necessarily because it was only women who were entitled, but because they said it was the first time they would see themselves recognized in a context where at the end of the day, it was almost entirely women who were doing this. They were like, we want to see ourselves named and recognized in the constitutional provision. So I just wanted to point that out and to say that even though it looks like it's an essentialist provision, in other words, that only women could do that, that it was a strategic and political decision that came out of grassroots women's struggle and insistence that they wanted themselves named there. But the point that you're making, Maria, is a really important one in terms of understanding that social reproduction is and should be for everyone. Alexandrina, and then I'll go on.
Good morning, and
hello.
Thank you very much. I think that language is a decisive factor, however we decide to move forward. Factory, to me, denotes a workplace.
Thank you.
And if there is a workplace, then we're talking about income. We're talking about wages. We're talking about salaries. It is very significant if we want to change the narrative, if we want to see a shift in the way people perceive who is a housewife and who is not a housewife. The language that we use when we are doing our white paper or our briefs is very, very important because it sends a message as to the importance of the work of women, not only in the private sphere, but also in the public sphere. And I recognize that what we're focusing on primarily is in the private sphere. I would like to touch a little bit here on the whole gender issues, is because how some of us in privileged positions see women who work with us. What significance, what value do we place on the women who come into our households? So when we're changing the narrative, when we're shifting the language, we need to take all of that into consideration.
Thank you so much. No, this is great. Y'all gonna have me here till midnight tonight because we need to get through like a third of what I getting through. And I still got one set more questions for y'all, and then I'm gonna really try to rush through. But that was fantastic, Alexandrina. And I think you really sort of hit the nail on the head, both you and Maria, in terms of thinking about the importance of this language and recognizing that even though, for example, we're talking about a household, we're saying, okay, but if we are going to respect folks in the workplace, think about gender equality at the workplace, all of these things, these conversations can't take place outside of a reorganization fundamentally of what takes place at the domestic domain. So here are some examples of how I see—
Alissa, I'm sorry, before you move on, sorry, this is Maggie. I think you don't see the chat because
no, I don't.
Kimali is raising an important point on the chat.
Okay, can someone read that for me?
Sure. Kimali says, it takes away the assumption that this work is being done out of love and an innate feminine benevolence. Is that the word?
Benevolence.
Yeah.
Right.
Benevolence, yes.
Okay.
Sure,
so,
love might be part of it, but it's not like there's much of a choice. And if it doesn't take place, it will cause the larger economy to crumble.
Absolutely. So thank you, Kimberly, for that. Kimberly's, so that's really important. So let me just say this, and then I'll come back to Kimberly's point. These terms allow us to think about the home as a center for the production of labor power, right? So calling it a factory also allows us to think about the household as a place where work takes place, also as a place where inequalities are present, right? So factory, by using the word social factory, they're not romanticizing the idea of the factory as a workplace. They're saying there are inequalities and inequities and violences of all kinds that we also need to pay attention to. By calling it an unwaged producer, it is saying that it adds value. It adds value. It adds value to the economy. it subsidizes the formal economy, right? Things would actually probably cost even more in our capitalist economy if you actually had to pay all of these people who are doing this unwaged work in the household to do it. And it tells you that this is actually essential work. It's not work that somebody's doing as a personal service to you. The point that Kimberly makes is very important because when we think about the caring work, it is, and what we're saying here is not at all to make invisible the forms of intimacy, affection, love, kinship that govern how we are in relation to each other, or that govern how we should be in relation to each other. What the Time Use Survey and these feminist campaigns are saying is that those relations of intimacy and love get distorted and degraded by a system that doesn't value mutual exchanges of reciprocity, that doesn't value stuff, that doesn't have a way of recognizing it within a sort of capitalist system in which the price of a commodity is expressed through a wage or a salary is a sign of it. So that all of those caring relations are seen as secondary to the labor relation is expressed through a price, right? So what they're really trying to do is sort of shift that around. And hopefully these last slides, before I get to the floods very quickly, I'm definitely, wherever I am on the slides at 11:30, I'm going to stop so we can do the breakout rooms for 7 minutes and then come back. So the Global Strike came up with a campaign, and their slogan was "All Women Count." All women count. The image at the top I'll come back to in a second because it's a really important image. Last time, I'm going to open up right now for some questions so that I can get through the rest of today's class. But what is the significance of this slogan? So thinking about language, you know, we had during the last economic crisis, the 99% was a very sort of powerful slogan. The one that we have chosen as the title for this course comes from something written by Andaye during a strike in a mining community in Guyana 8 years ago. How will we organize to live? Which to me is a really powerful slogan. During the Tambourine Army's ordeal in Jamaica, trying to address sexual violence in the church, the slogan that I think Andaye again, but some of us came up with in the Caribbean was "Touch one, touch all," as a way of signaling a regional solidarity. So all women count. What is the significance of that slogan? If, you know, why would that be? You may or may not agree it's a powerful slogan, but let's just assume it's a powerful slogan. Why is it a powerful slogan? Or what does it say?
All women count.
Mm-hmm. Who's that?
Oh, am I not on mute?
No, don't go on mute now. You got caught.
Oh, God. Okay, it's Kimberly.
Okay, Kimberly.
I was just thinking, like, I think, okay, so if we say all women, we're not just talking about like women who the traditional formal economy recognizes as workers. We're talking about women who also exist outside, so women in the informal economy. But then I also think about the implications for how we understand women as a spectrum and gender as a spectrum. And that could be an opportunity to bring in women who have been left out of the larger women's rights and feminist movements, maybe because they are trans, or maybe because they are non-binary, or maybe because they are poor, rural, working women. So I think it also challenges who tends to be included in larger feminist women's rights movements, and whose demands are being heard and whose demands are not being heard.
Beautiful. That's actually excellent. And I'm just going to run with that. I think Kimberly sort of raised two of the really important things there. On the one hand, and I'll just show you how I did it, because sometimes I like to play. I love words. I should just say to you all, I play with the dictionary, and the thesaurus is my best friend. I like playing with grammar as well. But here are three ways in which we can think about this. And the first two are exactly what Kimberly sort of said, which was One, that, you know, this importance of making this work visible, that all women count. We have to make this work visible. We have to think about how value needs to be rethought. We have to emphasize the importance of caring and effective labor. So all women, as in all the people who are doing this work, predominantly count. The second one, all, emphasizing the all women count. What does it mean to actually take that all very seriously? When usually, you know, we could think about the Black Lives Matter and how some of the opposition to that was, well, all lives matter, except that some people who are saying all lives matter usually use it as a way of not dealing with anti-Black racism. But here I want to suggest that to take that word all women count very seriously means precisely to open up to questions that Kimberly has asked there. What do we mean by the category women? So how do we open that up to think about non-binary, gender non-conforming, or folks count?
Many people buy the trans. Yeah, but she cannot buy it. Look, she's not buy it.
Somebody got to go on mute there. Yeah. There's a great example of the domestic work that goes on while the call goes on. So actually that was a perfect interruption. What does it mean to think, as Kemily said, of all women in terms of thinking about questions of class, of geography, of age, of gender, right? So what does it mean to actually understand that we're talking about unity, but not a simple solidarity or unity that comes at the expense of recognizing difference. And by difference, I mean differences in the way in which we're related to each other, differences that are the result of historical and contemporary power differentials between us. And then the last one, which I sort of really like, I put a comma in between the second and the third word and 2 exclamation marks at the end, because it's a politics of involvement. It's an imperative. All women count. In other words, let us all get involved. This will only change if we are all part of a struggle, right? So thinking about that is also really important when we devise our own campaigns or our own strategies. Like, how do we language them? What names do we give to them? How do we inspire people to get involved? And where does the money come from? If we are going to recognize unwaged work, if we are going to remunerate it properly, where would it come from? You know, sadly, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that this is a question of politics, that when the money has to be directed to the health services and to keeping essential services open, the government can actually find that money. And the global strikes argument is that what it requires is for us to really make a concerted effort to shift our global realities and our global priorities. And so their slogan, which is very effective, I would suggest, is invest in caring, not in killing. It's a slogan that you're asked to repeat every March 8th, invest in caring, not in killing. In other words, if you redirected money from the military, these are the statistics they're telling you, just 10% of that would actually provide the essentials of life for all. So it's a question of our global priorities that has to do with the way in which value gets defined, and the value gets defined that is seen to be natural, but in fact is not, right? So how do we shift that conversation? And as Selma put it here, which is really wonderful in relation to the military and the home carer, the person whose business is death, the military, the soldier, is named the worker, but the person whose business is life, the wife of the husband who was interviewed by the ILO in 1977, is not. Okay, so for the global strike then, what we are talking about is targeting global priorities in which currently profits are more important than human relations, right? Profits become more important than human relations. And they, just last week, had an amazing open letter and a call with hundreds of folks from around the world who dialed in. I'll leave these slides up so that folks can access them after. You can actually go online and sign this letter, but which was talking about a response to the COVID pandemic. And it's not a new response. They've been talking about this for decades. So it's like, how do we draw on our campaign, Invest in Caring, Not in Killing, to argue for a different kind of world now? Okay, so having done that, I'm really going to try to, in the next maybe 15 to 20 minutes, whip through these slides. Vanessa and Joy and any other Red Thread women on here, please, my apologies if I get any of this wrong. Y'all can interrupt. I'm going to end early, I promise. So when you go into breakout rooms and come back, there's a question for Red Thread specifically, where you could actually say most of what Alissa said was stupidness, and here's the real truth. But very quickly, having sort of talked about the division of labor with you, having talked about the importance of social reproduction, having talked about what it means to take that knowledge and turn it into an activist campaign and how to language it, I wanted to spend the last bit of today's class just walking you through an example of how that kind of knowledge got mobilized to respond to a devastating set of floods that took place in Guyana starting in January, on January 15th, I believe, 2005. These floods went on for 7 weeks and ended up affecting close to 40% of the population. For folks who are not that familiar with Guyana, what you're seeing right there is the Atlantic Ocean and a seawall, and those little sticks of those three things on the left side of your image is a coker, or it's a hydraulic system that lets water off of the land it lets water off of the land and back into the sea during the low tide. Guyana is actually 6 feet below sea level. When I say Guyana, I mean a really narrow, miserable, mosquito swamp driven but deeply rich alluvial mud, 10-mile wide strip of land running along the Atlantic coast, right? This is where the majority of Guyanese, the disgusting Black and Indian people, which I'm part of, believe that we must fight for this turf, regardless of everybody else, including the 10% of Amerindians who live in the hinterland. But this is the piece of land that all Guyanese like to fight over, well, the two main ethnic groups. But it's 6 feet below sea level, and it was only made habitable through enslaved and later indentured people digging, but predominantly enslaved people digging what Walter Rodney describes as 100 million metric tons of mud in order to reclaim this swamp and make it habitable, right? So that actually is reclaimed land that you're looking at, but it's very vulnerable to floods. As you can see, it's this little seawall that keeps the Atlantic Ocean out. And the result of unusually high rain combined with the depleted physical infrastructure led to this devastating flood that affected over 40% of the population. These slides come to you courtesy of unfortunately, they're the best slides we have, of someone who has proven himself to be completely racist and misogynist right now in the response to the political crisis going on in Guyana. But sadly, because I know Maya laughing when she see his name at the bottom there, because I was just abusing him up this morning in a public forum, but I had to use these slides. But this gives you a sense of what was happening in villages and communities all along the coast, including many of the Red Thread sisters who are on this call, whose houses and personal belongings were also affected and lost as a result of this. These are just some slides that give you a sense of what, and these are not, these are streets that we're looking at, right? These are actual streets that vehicles would be passing through. That's what they turned into. As we can see with this Indigenous woman, folks became fairly creative in how they were actually responding to the floods in various kinds of ways. Folks lost cattle, they lost poultry, they lost pigs, they lost, basically their livelihoods. Relief efforts began fairly belatedly, but started to ramp up. This is an example of the Red Cross. And then there was a larger initiative that sort of began called the Guyana Citizens Initiative. And Red Thread had begun to start doing some relief work, but making a clear principle of only working with other groups or organizations that did not take any funding from any agency, right? So they were very clear that they wanted to be completely accountable. They did not want any of the relief work that they were initially involved in to be divided along partisan lines, and that they did not want to work with anyone like the Red Cross, who was taking money from agency. So Red Thread started, and Guyana Citizens Initiative was one of the groups that they were part of. And they began by engaging in various kinds of relief efforts. They set up medical clinics in some of the communities, and they also started to distribute aid, toilet paper, and those kinds of things. But Red Thread, from the time that it got involved, they made it very clear that their initial focus, and so this is where we see the understanding of social reproduction, the understanding of the uneven distribution of labor in the household, which means that when crises happen, the impact is differentially felt. It was that kind of understanding that led Red Thread from the beginning to decide that they were going to focus on the most vulnerable. In the context of the floods, that was defined as people like the elderly, those who are pregnant, breastfeeding mothers, persons with disabilities, women and children. Like, they made an explicit commitment that these were the folks that they were responding to. So it was a recognition of differentiated vulnerabilities at a time when the relief that was taking place everywhere else on the coast was just everyone was equal, when in fact everyone was not equal. So women, for example, who couldn't come out to the roadside because the relief trucks would come to the road and then just throw the relief goods in the water, and people had to scramble for it. So if you were disabled, you couldn't do it. If you were a nursing mother at home, you couldn't leave your children and come out. Women who had to walk through the water were ending up with all kinds of vaginal and other kinds of infections, right? So recognizing that differentiated set of vulnerabilities was where Red Thread actually began to pay attention to how disability, gender, class, and age were making the impact of the flood more clearly felt than in other areas. And like I said, I want to emphasize that the majority of the Red Thread women are themselves grassroots women. One of them, Pamela, is in a wheelchair, so that these would have been things that would have been at the forefront of their minds, because it was part of their everyday lived experiences, right? So as I said, the aid that was coming in other places, it was prioritizing the able-bodied, prioritizing people's parties, supporters, prioritizing who people knew. And what was becoming increasingly clear was that the vulnerable, as we can see in these images, were largely those responsible for picking up the pieces in their households and communities. But as more and more, as word got out, more and more women began turning up to Red Thread. More and more women began turning up to Red Thread, looking for support and looking for relief. And at that point, it became very clear to the Red Thread sisters that this was not actually a model that was sustainable, that they were not interested in a model that was based upon relations of charity, so that even if it was principled relations of charity, that is, that we could account for every cent we got, it was still charity, that Red Thread was not the solution, that the problem was systemic. In other words, what these women were coming with was symptoms of a deeply sort of distorted set of relations in the society that had led both to the collapse of the physical infrastructure, but to the fact that poor people were the ones who were catching the most tail with the floods. And so Red Thread decided that they had to move from a model of charity to one where they were actually working with, learning from and with, and organizing with the women. How would they begin informing each other? How would they share ideas and solutions? How do they help to facilitate a space? It's not like the Red Thread women had the answers. So it's not that they're coming to lecture to the women, but how might they open up space in the center? And these are images, beautiful images that hopefully you all saw the film that the sisters did, and the script that accompanies the film. How do they actually facilitate and hold space for folks to begin seeing each other, talk across their differences? And I want to emphasize that in a very racially divided country, that Black and Indian women and Amerindian women, but Black and Indian women in particular, were able to come together and hold space, see each other, and to craft a series of demands that would then be presented. And there's Andai at the table in black, and Wintress, who is another courageous sister from Red Thread, in the blue and black. She's also a domestic worker and a small business person who owns a little shop in her community. I'm not sure she's on the call because not all of the sisters have access to internet or electricity. But it brought together this meeting brought together, they summoned, and it was hundreds of women, as you would have seen from the film. They summoned donors, trade unions, the government, agencies, the regional democratic councils. They summoned doctors, NGOs, and members of parliament. And at this meeting where they testified, they made a number of demands. They wanted debt relief. They wanted an audit of all of the relief funds that was going to Red Cross and other places. They wanted cleaning supplies to be distributed to communities. They wanted a recognition of the vulnerable people in communities. They wanted an inquiry into why the flood happened so that it couldn't happen again. They wanted to find out what arrangements were being made for students in the context of disrupted education. Think of all this as we're thinking about the COVID pandemic. They wanted to put on the table the question of how we plan for future disasters. And really, and most importantly, at least for me, was that they managed to secure 10,000 Guyana dollars, which isn't a lot, but at the time was pretty significant symbolically for each household, because at first the government was drawing up compensation based on a notion of who had a job. And if we go back to the very start of my class today, you understand how problematic that is. And these amazing women managed to challenge that definition of what compensation looks like and say, for those of us who are unwaged, for those of us who have subsistence gardens, for those of us who've lost our pots and pans, this must also be compensated. So you know, if you drop a balance sheet, they got the cleaning supplies, they were able to secure the $10,000 each. But the more important thing I think that they managed to do is to begin to work together across difference. I'm not going to read this out. I'm going to assume that you either read the little handout that Red Thread did themselves, or you will go read it after. This is beautiful because it shows you that they're saying, going back to Kimberly's point about all women count and we're not all the same. We're mothers, we're cane farmers, we're garment workers, security guards, domestics, we're market vendors, we're farmers, we're housewives and caregivers. You know, so they're saying, they're calling for a unity in all their diversity. And they're saying that based on their conversations and based on their recognition of this unpaid work, and based on the recognition that without this work, the economy cannot survive, they're saying this is what we demand. We're not asking for a handout, we're demanding what we're actually entitled to. Okay, and the last two slides, few slides, and then I'm going to go to the breakout rooms now. I want to sort of just wrap up where we have come from by turning to the work of this incredible American transgendered activist called Dean Spade and their work on mutual aid, which to me in the Caribbean, and this is from Guyana, I'm sure the rest of you hopefully in your breakout rooms will have other terms, whether Maria in Spanish or other folks. We say one dirty bill dam, going back to that slide with the, going back to the, where is it? Going back to this slide, the dam or the seawall, one dirty bill dam. In other words, everybody do a little piece, and that's the only way that we will get through anything together. And then the other one, which most of y'all are probably familiar with, hand wash hand, make hand come clean. Mutual aid, Dean Spade tells us, is a form of political participation, right? So it's not just that you're helping out each other, but through the helping out of each other, you're coming to see each other, learn to work with each other differently, work through whatever challenges or conflicts, work out different relations in articulating demands, and then building capacity for future struggles, right? And as they point out, the most visible mutual aid work is happening when crises happen, right? Where failures of dominant infrastructures take place, and all of these informal kinds of practices that are always existing in your community, but become multiplied or become visible or become absolutely important in the context of sort of struggling for survival. And we saw this in terms of the Red Thread shift from a model of charity, right? A model of charity, which is usually about giving to the poor or giving to people who have less than you. And when you do that, it comes with a whole set of value systems about who is deserving and who is not, who is respectable and who is not. Moreover, a charity model also allows the state to get off the hook. So if you go back to my earlier example with the Caribbean feminist strategy in relation to Beijing, they went both as NGOs, but they also went making sure they had done their work to shape the government position. So the work is done inside and outside. The charity model could be one where you do all this little work and then you don't pay any attention to the importance of public investment in physical infrastructure, in education, in health, etc. So the move from a model of charity to a model of solidarity is really important. And that model of solidarity helps you to build this capacity for self-organization and self-determination, or what Guyanese historian Walter Rodney refers to as the principle of self-emancipation. It is only direct action on the part of people, your own perception of what is possible, that can produce fundamental change. So what are the ways in which you might challenge some kind of oppression? So Dean Spade has 3 elements. One is challenging a form of oppression. So then an example would have been Red Thread deciding to challenge a model that just threw relief out to everyone and say, when you do that, you're ignoring pregnant women, women with disabilities. How might it also provide for people? So when they actually provided material support, that was the hook that got women into the center at the start, even though Red Thread didn't see it as a hook. And then how do you move towards imagining alternatives, which was the conversation that Red Thread began to build with the women that allowed them to lead to that March 15th Speak Out. Very slow, right? This work is very slow. And quite frankly, much of that work that Red Thread did, so much of that is probably damaged and undone right now by the racial sort of crisis provoked in Guyana at the moment, with the fact that our elections have still not come to an end. But one of the things that came out of the flood organizing was a group called Grassroots Women Across Race. They're not formally part of Red Thread because you have to sign on to certain principles to be part of Red Thread, and not all the women sign on to those principles. And you know, the one that they really don't like is the one that bans any form of corporal punishment against children. But Grassroots Women Across Race came directly out of that group. And here's 2 examples. I'm not going to spend much time on this because I want to get to the breakout rooms, but just to say that last week's class with Maya on hurricanes and the example that she gave of the food justice approaches in Puerto Rico were a really wonderful example of mutual aid that made it possible for people to eat. They were also the different ways in which people began to use that to talk about the failures of Puerto Rico's political system, the failures of its colonial relationship with the United States, led to the demands for Rousselot, the governor, to step down. That was daily meetings, banging of pots, daily gatherings, daily sort of encuentros with Puerto Ricans sitting in circles and talking. And you know, that these alternatives already existed before the disaster came. And the question is, how do we then work with them and amplify them? So let me just wrap up here by saying then that, you know, if we end by thinking about the current crisis we're in, and I'm talking to you from a bedroom where I'm sort of locked into a house until this thing eases down. But what has the COVID-19 pandemic revealed to us about questions of value and how arbitrary, by which I mean how associated with dominant power they are? The crisis has sort of turned that upside down, right? What is essential is not the financiers and the stockbrokers, it's the grocery store owners and the taxi drivers and the nurses and the, you know, so this example on the left is from a hospital in Toronto where folks have been writing all of these things to the nurses. Last night, the kids on my street sent a little note asking everyone to come out at 7:30 with pots and pans to bang and thank all of the essential workers. On the right is going for a walk in the morning, and on garbage day in Toronto, on Thursdays or garbage day, people are putting these kinds of signs on their garbage bins, thank you for your public service. That it has provided an opportunity for us to really rethink the question of value, to rethink the question of work, and to rethink the question of social health. When we think about the COVID pandemic and rethinking the front line, these are examples of folks sewing masks in Guyana now to protect, and this commitment to have every Guyanese have at least 1, if not 2 or 3 masks. But this is again an example of that kind of caring social reproductive labor that has become so visible in the contemporary moment. This poem by Lorna Goodison, Praise to the Power of Our Guinea Woman Great-Grandmother, it's the same poem. Higgler with pencil in her tie head to cancel all the debts. Seamstress with the scissors in her right hand, who will cut for us fit pattern. And yesterday, one of the Red Thread members, Sherlina Nagir, posted a really beautiful letter in one of our newspapers, which is the point of departure for our breakout room exercise, where she said that we must not only distribute food hampers, but why don't we think about mutual aid as something that will take us beyond this crisis? That if we have an opportunity to really begin the work of changing how we live our lives, what might that look like? And the suggestion that she offered was, in the food hampers, we should be putting in seeds. What would it mean to distribute not just hampers, but seeds? And hello, folks, anybody from Barbados, don't take offense, but you really don't have no proper market if you look at the Guyanese market. So this would be a really excellent example of a mutual aid effort that has a transformative capacity. So you're distributing to people seeds as well as hampers for them to cook right now. And then you could think of all kinds of online and public related exercises to get children into kitchen, garden, farming, etc. So I wanted to use this as an example, and the top of it, because what the world needs now is healing, the top of it is a sister from, that might be Border or Stabroek market. She has her name. She's actually a bush woman, and she's selling various, whether it's soursop leaf for cancer, whether it's, so at the top is a healer, potion, a medicine woman. And I like that slide because it tells us about the way in which we, people, animals, the world right now needs healing. So at this point, I'm going to ask Roberta and Maya to organize us. It's 11:30, maybe for 10 minutes into breakout rooms. And these are are you able to see these questions if you go into your breakout rooms? So there are two dimensions. Can you identify who in your countries would you identify as the frontline workers who have been revealed by the COVID pandemic? That's number one. And then the second one would be, can you identify any initiatives in your community or country, or that you're involved in, that sort of builds upon what we've talked about today in terms of social reproduction, or anything that you see that excites you that might offer an alternative template for the world we live in? And then for the red thread women, I wanted, when we came back, for you also to have an opportunity to spend about 5 or 7 minutes sharing with the group, were there any lessons for you that came out of the flood organizing that you think we could draw on in the current pandemic? So Roberta and Maya, over to you all. And thank you so much for your wonderful attention and for the just incredible contributions to the questions.